Okay, hello. I'm Bob Ziff, as many of you know, from chemical engineering, and I'm going to give a talk. Thank you for inviting me for a recorded seminar on the COVID coronavirus epidemic, or I should say pandemic now. This was originally a talk that I gave in the Center for the Study of Complex Systems, but Ashwin invited me to give a talk in material science, and I updated it, although I decided not to update it completely because it's interesting to compare what goes on. Oh, I have the wrong date here. It's April 10th now. And the original talk I gave was March 10th, exactly 1 month ago. And I started this work around February 10th, and things change drastically from month to month, as everybody knows. So I'm using like two devices here because I seem to have a trouble with the microphone on my computer. So I hope this is being recorded. Okay, so this is a picture of me. I was in Bangkok in early January. And Bangkok, by the way, is full of a lot of Chinese tourists. Luckily, I didn't go to the major tourist spots since I go there every year. But just an example of people traveling back and forth in Asia before any travel ban that obviously brought a lot of stuff here. Although I never got sick at all, so I don't think I brought anything. But it could have been, many people could have done that. Okay, here I'll start off talking about just a little background. Some of the deadly viruses, of course, are pretty deadly. There was the Marburg virus not too long ago that transferred from monkeys, and it's called hemorrhagic fever. That means it causes bleeding throughout your body. That sounds pretty bad. The Ebola virus has up to 71% mortality. But it is spread through bodily fluids, so it also is not that easy to spread. Luckily, it has been pretty much, eliminated. Rabies is a virus, of course, that causes lots of trouble throughout the world. HIV still is infecting like 1 million people a year. I'm sorry, killing 1 million people a year. It is actually the deadliest modern virus. It's an example how we have come to accept large infections. Of course, it's pretty much under control through these cocktail of drugs in many places in the world, but place in Africa, it is not. Smallpox, the scourge for centuries, killed 500 million people in its last 100 years of existence. It was completely wiped out by basically what we're trying to do right now, social distancing, isolating people, mainly isolating people. And actually, there were some people at the University of Michigan involved in stamping out the last cases of it around the world. Influenza, the common flu, does kill 500,000 people a year worldwide. That's quite a few, and sometimes people compare the coronavirus to that, but the thing to remember is that many people who die of the flu really are dying from something else, but the flu is kind of the last straw. Now, here is the SARS coronavirus. Oh no, the SARS, which was just a few years ago, but that was also held to a very low number of people. Only 770 people died. Now, the Black Plague, which is obviously one of the worst diseases in history, um, although not as bad as smallpox, really. Anyway, it is not a flu. It was a bacterial disease. This is the famous doctor mask to treat people. It should be interesting to notice that we use the word quarantine. It comes from an Italian word that means 40 days because the plague came to Europe from Asia through Italy. That's kind of a little bit ironic. And in Venice, they required that a boat be quarantined for 40 days. It had to fly a special flag. They still use a special flag. Here it is, black and yellow for it. And here is the coronavirus. You've seen millions of pictures of these by now. I was trying to learn, of course, I'm not a virologist, so a biologist trying to learn about this. This is a computer generated picture. And this is actual picture, although these colors are completely artificial. Here is a cell that is apoptotic, which means it's dying or being killed, dying cell. And the purple little dots are the coronaviruses. They're nice little balls, about 100 nanometers, a tenth of a micron in diameter. So they're extremely small compared to a cell. Here's what they look like in the electron microscope, and you can see those famous spikes around it. Actually, John Mansfield, who of course was a research scientist in material science, an electron microscope expert, he sent me this picture from a friend of his in Australia that is considered a very high quality picture of this, showing the spikes. So what is going on? What is going on in this thing? Well, the main thing about a virus is it's not really alive. It doesn't eat or breathe, but it just goes in and takes over the mechanism, the machinery of a cell to basically get reproduced. I guess in a way that's what we're all trying to do in life. So it's pretty smart, in fact, incredible how kind of unfortunate, but incredibly how powerful evolution is to develop things like this. It has an RNA strand, a very long one, 30,000 units long. So it's a pretty sophisticated form of life. RNA strand in the center it's not really shown here, with other proteins that wrap around it, that hold it in place and protect it. And then it has these famous spikes on the outside, and it has a lipid bilayer on the outside. This is called an enveloped virus. And lipid bilayer is just, lipid is like fat. It's like the layer on the outside of every cell. And where does it get that bilayer? It steals it from the cell that it exits from. It doesn't produce its own lipid bilayer. It like breaks off a piece of the bilayer, and then it has this outside like a cell. And then there are other special proteins that help it infect other cells. The spike connects on to other cells in the respiratory system, and it just at the time, and it has proteins that help it disable the immune response of the cell and of the organism, namely the humans. So it has a lot going on in it. Like I said, it's an enveloped virus. It has a lipid bilayer, and I said all this interact with the other one. A virus is dead. It doesn't breathe or eat. One thing to note about it, fortunately for us, it is rather fragile because that lipid bilayer has to have the right environment around it. Otherwise, if it dries out or anything else, it'll break up, and then the virus could not if you just like ate the pure RNA, I don't believe it really would get into any cell or anything like this. So luckily, it is a little fragile. It is a respiratory virus. That means it's spread by respiration, as opposed to other viruses that are spread by bodily fluids, etc., which means it's very easy to spread. A sneeze or anything else, or as you've all known in the flu, reading the news, even smelling someone's breath, if you could smell what someone had for lunch and they have the virus, okay, you got it too. New York Times just recently had a very interesting, a couple of days ago, very nice graphics on the cell too. They have their own picture of it. And here it shows how the RNA strand has proteins that are actually attached to it that really hold it in place. People have, of course, sequenced all 30,000 units or bases of the RNA. In fact, they sequenced many of them and found, of course, there is mutations, and there is the virus that went through Europe has different mutations than one that came straight from China. In fact, they just showed that basically virtually all the people in New York got the virus through people from Europe, not directly from China. So anyway, people have sequenced it, and people have figured out what are all the proteins and what are all the structures. And the people actually, quote, people, involve someone at University of Michigan, as I'll show you in a minute. But anyway, here are just to give you an idea of some of the proteins that are produced. There is something called a bubble maker that it creates a bubble inside the cell. There is some scissors that cut the proteins from, first a large one is made and then it's broken up. There is, of course, something that needs to trigger the cell to copy the RNA code. There's something called a viral proofreader that actually checks that it was actually copied correctly and cuts out the errors, which means that actually this virus mutates a lot less than some other viruses, which is good from the point of view of making a vaccine. Here's the famous spike protein that goes on the outside, and actually 3 of them join together, and then here it shows how it attaches to something called ACE2, a receptor on cells in the airways, and once it attaches on, then it can invade. Well, it turns out there's a professor at Michigan, Yang Zhang, in the Department of Biological Chemistry in the School of Medicine, who the computational work, and he has done fantastic work in just taking this code and figuring out what all the proteins are and figuring out what the shapes of the proteins are. This was a major advance, protein folding. First people tried to fold it, but they have other ways of figuring out without really folding to the complete sequence, figuring out what shapes these sequence produces, and then what are all the functions of it. And this is how the New York Times actually got those beautiful pictures. And interestingly enough, I didn't know about him or his work until I read about it in the New York Times. He actually also, if you look on his webpage, he designed peptides, which are just other proteins or other sequences that attach to this receptor. And if you could make these peptides and give it to a person, they will block the virus so it won't attack your cells anymore. It will block it and it won't work. So he's actually made this available. Anybody could try it out. He's figured out possible, like possible ones that people could use. Anyway, it's well known that it's thought to come in a bat. For some reason, coronaviruses live in bats pretty well, and they don't really make them too sick. But then it's been shown that this animal, like an armadillo called a pangolin, which is highly desired in the East, in China and other countries for medicinal purposes, including its meat and its scales, and to the point of being pushed to extinction in many places. And it's been shown that this animal, which exists in these live meat markets, is believed to have carried it. In fact, the same person at Michigan, Yang Zhang, wrote a paper to prove that it did not go through a snake, as some people proposed, but he showed that it was very likely to go through that animal. So the disease starts in the lungs. It triggers the immune response system. If it goes deep inside the lung, then you're in real trouble. It can destroy the lung tissue, which causes inflammation, then causes pneumonia. And as everyone knows, that get pneumonia so bad you get no oxygen, and that's it. Here's back to my original slides from T27. There was some discussion that that it doesn't attack young people, and it is true there's a low fatality rate. However, still a lot of young people get it, and even if you have a low fatality rate, young people are dying, as opposed to what some people are saying. And one thing to keep in mind is young people, even young people when they get sick, require hospitalization and ventilators. So if we run out of hospital beds, then we're going to get more deaths of young people. It's a famous thing that in China, a lot more men got it, but they think smoking had a lot to do with it. But it's still true, men get it. And men are even now, men are diagnosed at a higher rate than women in hospitals, believed to be because men wait longer to go to the hospital. Okay, here I'll show you the work that I did. I started looking at this and I tried to model it, and I have a background in percolation, things like this. So I was looking at a certain way of looking at it. Percolation is networks, and epidemiology, both spread of a disease, is also a kind of percolation. So now it's pretty easy to download data from a variety of sources, but I started off just going to the situation reports. I actually started this in January, and the World Health Organization started these situation reports on January 21st. And every day they have this report that showed, in those days, like here is report number 49, in those days they were showing China outside of China, because it was mainly China where things were going on. In those days, there were, So this shows like the first report, it explained certain things we all know about now, the history of it. You could go back and look at all the reports. Shows what, even in the report number 1, there was just China, Japan, Korea, and Thailand, the place I had been in January. And there were only 282 confirmed cases. Now, what I was looking at is I looked at these deaths, and I looked at it on a log-log plot. The normal epidemiological approach is to do like a log normal plot, look for exponential growth. But log-log plot is power law growth, and this is something you expect from fractal networks or complicated small world type of networks where people have connections to other places. And incredibly, I found incredible good fit to a log-log plot with a slope of about 2.26. So the number of deaths is proportional to time to the power 2.26. There is one little subtle point about this, that when you do a log-log plot, what you call time equals zero does affect it, not like a log normal plot where you still get a straight line, whatever you call time zero. So anyway, but it doesn't affect it that much. We got incredible behavior. Every day I was found, wow, I could predict almost exactly what the number of deaths will be the next day. And I wrote a paper on this, including with my daughter, Anna, who is a graduate student of economics at Duke University, and she's an expert on all kind of statistical analysis and things like this. So I wrote a paper I posted on the medRxiv, which is obviously an archive that focuses on medical research, in February 17th and updated 3.1. Now I'm writing a paper that will update it more. And the basic thing is here is her statistical analysis to show statistically there is very good confidence that we do have power law behavior in that exponent. It predicted tens of thousands of deaths in a few months if not controlled. I wrote in my first version of the paper, there'll be like 50,000 deaths, in the next 3 months if we don't control it. And that was pretty close to what we're coming up to right now. The big question is when we control it, when we not. Of course, I did not, predict it would just become major throughout the world. Here shows the cumulative deaths worldwide, and what was happening then here, just to show you how up to, this is a month ago, it was following that log-log plot pretty well, but then it was dropping off because of the incredible drop-off in China. And in China, they did an incredible job. They showed the world it is possible to really wipe out the disease by extreme measures. And it looked like things were really looking pretty good. So, at that time it didn't look quite so bad. Things were coming down a little bit. But everybody knows what happens after that. It really started taking off in the rest of the world. So things got a lot more panicky. And so at that point, I did figure out I did focus a month ago just on China. And if you looked at China, it was following this law pretty well. But then it really started to cut down. And here I'm showing the daily rate in China. At a certain point, it really the daily rate just started dropping exponentially. And now it really has completely dropped down to virtually zero, although there is some question about the veracity of all of this. But anyway, that's the behavior in China. So the rest of the world, this was again a month ago. I did not update this. You could see how the rest of the world was taking off exponentially. Here's a log normal plot, and a straight line means exponential, and the rest of the world was taking off exponentially. Now, one interesting thing is the peak in the number of cases, daily cases in China, occurred. This was around these are dates from January 21st, so this was around February 10th. The peak in the number of confirmed cases was around then. The peak in the number of deaths occurred about a week or two later. But here is a rather shocking fact that when we had a peak in the number of confirmed cases in China, there were only 450 deaths. Obviously, there were a lot of people who were still sick who could have died, and there were obviously a lot of people who had not been confirmed yet or maybe even caught it yet. So from that day to now, the number of deaths has gone up by, like 3,300 has gone up by a factor of 8. So it's kind of a shocking thing that even once we reach a peak, we could go up by a factor of 8 for the total number of deaths. Of course, the United States is just possibly peaking in New York. We have like 5,000 deaths in New York City, or New York State. So, 5 times 8 would be like, it would predict if the same thing happened, a total of 40,000 deaths by the time this thing ends. I don't know if it'll be that high, but it'll definitely be in over 10,000. Classical epidemiological modeling involves putting people in compartments, susceptible, infected, recovered, or susceptible, exposed, and then have certain rates between all the certain things. Then you write differential equations like the density of infected is some rate times like infected times susceptible minus the rate that the infected just recovers. So there's equations for infected and susceptible, and there's something called the reproduction rate, which is the average number of people you come in contact with times the rate that you infect them divided by the rate that you recover. That's the famous R naught you hear about. Then you solve this and you get, for very short times, you get exponential growth, and then later time it levels out to an S-shaped curve. Okay, that's one approach, and many people are using that approach to try to model it. Typically, it's good to model it when it's completely finished and it's all over with. If something grows circularly, like you have a mold that's just growing, Brandenburg wrote a paper on this, it's just growing like in a circle, then it'll grow as time squared because it's area. So that is power law growth with an exponent of 2. Here we're getting an exponent greater than 2. So one idea is to look at a percolation-like model, or another way of saying it is this SAR model, but on a lattice, where things grow out as a lattice. And I actually once studied this, and it actually grows at a critical point of something called a percolation cluster, and it grows in this fractal substrate. But it turns out that that still does not really give this exponent of 2.2. Okay, now it turns out that back in 2006, Alexei Vasquez wrote a model of basically like a network statistics, but he assumed a power law degree distribution. The probability you have k neighbors is k to the minus gamma. And then he showed that basically it leads to a power law growth, the daily rate leads to a power law growth with an exponential cutoff. This is very similar to the Chinese data I was showing. That it's first here is on a log-log plot, and this part is more power law growth, and then it's exponential, then power law, and exponential with a minus sign cutoff. And my daughter and I fit the data of China that was kind of bad to that curve, and it did seem to fit it pretty well. Okay, it turns out there are a lot of different papers. In fact, now they're literally in the thousands of papers on the archive, medRxiv, and bioRxiv. And a certain fraction of these involves modeling, and you could look at them. People model it different ways. I won't even go into that now. Of course, here's my old slide where I said a month ago, it's hard to imagine that WHO still was resisting calling it a pandemic, but CNN called it a pandemic first. Now, just to update this, I don't really have to do the work because a guy named Jack Marin, who is in Austria, he's an American, he's in Austria working there, and here you see he mentions our paper. He uses our idea and Vasquez's idea to try to model the growth. And he's a little smarter than me. I was doing it on Excel, and he figured out how to just automate the whole thing, read off. There are certain websites, read off the data. And here's different countries like Belgium. You could see how on a log-log plot, it's growing to a straight line. And this progression is like the slope of that, which is 3. Here's Brazil, also slope around 2.5. So you see these countries are growing, it's all growing the same way as China did in those days. Each country is a little different, though. It has a different value of that. South Korea has been very good in causing, in controlling it, and you can see the difference. Here's Luxembourg. Pretty straight line, although the slope is very low there, so that's good, but it is still growing. Spain, the slope is a lot higher, 4. And here is the sad story. The U.S. has on the log plot, the highest slope in the world. Of course, what this is there are areas, it's kind of a convolution of areas where it's growing exponentially, and then you put it all together, and you end up with this power law growth. So hopefully things will get better. There's another person who actually also has a connection to Michigan, named Richard Kohler and his wife Katka Bedova, who's from Slovakia, who I was on a project with him. He was a postdoc with Charlie During in the Center of Complex Systems in the Math Department of Michigan. And I knew him in the 2000s. And he went back to Slovakia, and he actually works for a group working with the government, just like we have Donald Trump and all of his lackeys giving all of his experts giving their reports every day. He's involved in the government of Slovakia, the report that's given every day. He's one of the researchers for it. And he's fitting it exactly to Vasquez's model, which we proposed to him to do. And here is showing the daily rate, like in Switzerland, it's actually starting to come down. So there is some good news there. Here he posted this April 8th, that's pretty recent. He said he was lucky enough to, this is some Facebook Translate, but he was lucky enough to appear on their news report, and he's also appeared in government briefings. You see there, they're not shy to wear face masks on news reports. Again, to show you how things have grown, this is the WHO report shows how here's report number 2. They started putting little circles around different cities. The biggest circle was greater than 100. And report keep going on. All of a sudden now it's went to Vietnam, Thailand. Here's report a few days later, all of a sudden 2 cases in the United States. It's hard to imagine how things have changed. Then all of a sudden I jumped to March, and now you see all over the world, now they don't do cities, just countries. And now a circle means greater than 5,000. And now March 5th, March 6th, and then all of a sudden the circles got smaller because now they say the biggest circle is greater than 10,000. Well, now jump to the reports from a few days ago from April 9th. Let's try that again. April 10th is the report number 80. I just pulled it down from the web. Now they don't do cities now they don't do circles anymore, just they color in the countries. And now the darkest color is greater than 50,000. We are now the highest number of cases in the world, although still not the highest number of deaths. Here is showing the number of cases, and you can see how this yellowish color was China, it went down. Then this orange color is Europe, it took over. And now America, which is mainly the United States, is taking over from Europe. So it's pretty shocking. You know the story, the whole history. I had this, that the Chinese, of course, minimized it at first. But finally, President Xi appeared wearing a mask and went down to a laboratory. They this was in March, in the article in the Atlantic say you're likely to get the coronavirus. That was kind of not, that was pretty shocking to say at the time. Now it's becoming a lot more true. Here's a Chinese activist, in Iran, there's a problem that the government hid it, and in a way they decided it wasn't even worth trying to try to control it. They just let people get it. Here's the famous health minister telling everyone things were okay while he was sweating, and he came down with it the next day. There are a lot of confirmed cases there. Of course, we thought that by closing the borders, we solved the problem, but just think of all the people who went back and forth before that time. Here's in Europe, fear spreads faster. The famous cruise ship, it was a non-intended human experiment, and they thought, well, we'll just quarantine everyone there till they get better, but it just shows how easily it travels. Even if you tried to keep everyone in their room, it didn't work. And of course, numerous cruise ships after this have had this problem. It's hard to imagine people are going to go on a cruise ship again for many years. And now, of course, we're seeing aircraft carriers, prisons, assisted living homes, or other places like this. Just a month ago, our president was saying that, think about it. This is not as, normal influenza kills a lot more people. Think about that. Well, think about this. If we just let it spread, it'll be more like the Spanish flu. But we all know that now. I don't have to go through this. Here's my final thoughts on March 10th. I was saying, at that time, there were still no cases around Michigan, but I said it seems likely that, there are already cases on campus, already cases around here. We should operate on the assumption that it's already here. The university was, of course, a little bit slow in closing down. If they were a little bit more prospective, they would have closed down before spring break or during spring break. We had students who came back here and left again. It's kind of bad. Clearly, the virus cannot be eliminated without some effective vaccines and treatments. This will not happen this year. Well, I mean this meaning the vaccines. Treatments should happen, not vaccines. I have to change that. There are many promising drugs being developed, including by people right here in Ann Arbor. There are biotech companies like Blue Willow, one that I know of, developing a nasal spray that kills the virus in your nose and does not need extensive FDA testing because it is not a vaccine. It also seems that this whole thing about producing masks and ventilators is going to be solved pretty soon. Obviously, there are a lot of factories in the world that can make these things. We just need to get politicians on board. We also need to get religious leaders on board. It is shocking that there are big, some pastors who are still holding services. There's also a problem in this Hasidic Jewish community in New York and Israel, where there's a big spread of the disease. In Pakistan, the clerics told people they have to keep going to mosques and everything. We also have to get the news networks on board, not to mention politicians. Clearly, we cannot remain on lockdown forever. We can't wait till there's 0 cases, obviously, because it's going to last a long time. But we have to wait until the sickness rate is down to the point that hospitals are not being swamped like they are being now. I just read about a woman who died from cancer because she could not get into U of M hospital because there were for some operation because there are no ventilators available. Perhaps we have to figure out how we could start businesses, but we have to have careful testing. I don't see anywhere you go today, and there's no one outside of a supermarket measuring your temperature like they do in China. But the big question we all have is, well, one question we have, can we have classes this fall? It's hard to imagine the way, students have so much direct interaction. It's hard to imagine that they could do that all from 6 feet away and wearing masks. But hopefully things will fall in place and we'll be able to have that. So with that, email me any questions, and thank you very much for this opportunity.